They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes the ties that bind a family are not veins, but secrets buried deep and lies painted gold. In the House of Sterling, the true inheritance was never the fortune, but the truth that would one day claw its way into the light. The funeral of Richard Sterling was a masterpiece of silent, expensive grief. Held at the family's sprawling New England estate, the air was thick with the scent of white lilies and unspoken avarice. The guests, a somber collection of America's elite, spoke in hushed, respectful tones about the legacy of the man who had built Sterling Enterprises from nothing. But the weight in the air was not sorrow. It was anticipation. Standing apart from the clusters of dark suits and pearl necklaces was Amelia Sterling, the youngest child, the family's designated black sheep. She watched the performance from the cold comfort of a large bay window, the gray afternoon light making her a silhouette against the manicured lawns. In a simple black dress, she was an island of genuine loss in an ocean of performance. Her grief was a quiet, hollow ache, a stark contrast to the dramatic yet dry-eyed display of her mother, Eleanor, who clutched the arm of her son, Ethan, the golden heir apparent. Seeking a moment of peace, Amelia slipped away from the grand hall, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floors. She found refuge in a small, forgotten library near her father's old study. But silence was a luxury the Sterling house rarely afforded. From the slightly ajar door of the study, she heard voices, clipped and sharp, slicing through the funereal gloom. It was her mother and her brother. "Everything is secure." Ethan's voice was a low, confident murmur, devoid of any sadness. "The board is aligned. There will be no surprises." Eleanor's reply was even colder, smoother than polished stone. "It's a relief it happened when it did. Your father, he was becoming unpredictable in his last few months. Too much reflection. It's a mercy he didn't have the chance to act on any sentimental impulses." A soft, dismissive sound followed, a chuckle. The sound hit Amelia with the force of a physical blow, a shard of ice piercing the fog of her grief. They weren't speaking of a husband, a father. They were speaking of an obstacle that had finally been removed. The carefully constructed facade of her family crumbled in that single, heartless moment, revealing the rotten core beneath. The tears she had been holding back froze in her eyes, turning her sorrow into something hard, cold, and dangerously clear. She understood then that this was not a family in mourning. It was a pack of predators, patiently waiting for the old lion to fall. And the feast was about to begin. To understand the will, you must first understand the dynasty that forged it. The Sterling family was not merely a family, it was an institution, a brand, an American myth meticulously crafted over 40 years. And at its center, until his final breath, was Richard Sterling. He was a man carved from granite and ambition, a titan of industry who had built his empire from the dirt and dust of a forgotten factory town. His public persona was that of a king, decisive, sharp, witted, with eyes that seemed to assess the value of everything and everyone they landed on. He spoke of strength as the ultimate virtue, of legacy as the only true immortality. To the world, Sterling Enterprises was a monument to his power. But to those few who knew him, truly knew him, Richard was a more complicated figure. He was a creator who had become a warden, a man who built a magnificent kingdom, but found himself trapped within its walls, surrounded by a court of his own making. He preached the gospel of strength, but in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, he perhaps wondered what true strength even looked like anymore. The queen of this kingdom was Eleanor Sterling. Where Richard was granite, Eleanor was porcelain, beautiful, cold, and prone to shattering if handled without the utmost care. She hailed from old money, a family whose wealth had faded but whose name still carried the weight of past glories. She saw her marriage to Richard not as a romance, but as a merger. He provided the raw power and the staggering fortune. She provided the pedigree, the social polish, the blueprint for turning a rich man into a powerful dynasty. Eleanor was the chief architect of the Sterling myth. Every party, every charity gala, every public appearance was a calculated move on her grand chessboard. Her love was not a nurturing warmth, but a conditional investment. She poured all of it into her son, Ethan, for he was her masterpiece. In her daughter, Amelia, she saw only a failed project, a crack in the perfect porcelain facade she had spent a lifetime maintaining. She viewed Amelia's artistic inclinations and emotional transparency not as character traits, but as defects, a genetic stain that reminded her of a world without polish, without control, a world she had fought so hard to leave behind. And then there was Ethan, the golden child, the crown prince. He was everything the Sterling name was meant to represent. He had his father's ambition and his mother's charm, all packaged in a flawless, Ivy League-educated physique. From the boardroom to the ballroom, Ethan moved with an unshakable confidence, a man who had never been told no and never expected to be. He learned his father's lessons on power, but he skipped the chapters on principle. He understood how to command respect, but not how to earn it. He saw the world as a series of acquisitions, of assets to be leveraged and competitors to be crushed. He believed in strength, but his version of it was brutal and hollow, a weapon to be wielded rather than a foundation to be built upon. To Ethan, the empire was not a responsibility to be stewarded. It was a prize he was owed, a birthright confirmed with every sycophantic nod and every fearful glance from his subordinates. He was the perfect son, the perfect heir, and in his perfection, he was a perfect stranger to the man who had created him. Finally, there was Amelia, the ghost at the feast, the black sheep. She was the family's repository for all the inconvenient emotions they had discarded. Vulnerability, doubt, passion, empathy. While Ethan was being groomed in boardrooms, Amelia was finding her voice in dusty art studios, her hands stained with paint and clay instead of ink from stock certificates. She had tried, for a time, to fit the mold. She had enrolled in business school, worn the right clothes, said the right things. But the performance was suffocating. The polished surfaces of her family's world reflected nothing real back at her. So she left. She fled to a small, chaotic apartment in New York City, choosing the uncertainty of an artist's life over the gilded certainty of a Sterling. Her family, especially her mother, called it an act of rebellion, of childish defiance. But for Amelia, it was an act of survival. It was a declaration that her soul was not for sale. The relationship between Amelia and her father was a quiet, painful paradox. He never publicly endorsed her path. He would offer gruff, non-committal responses whenever Eleanor lamented her daughter's choices. He upheld the family's official stance. Amelia was a disappointment. Yet, in the silence between the words, there was something else. He was the only one who ever asked, really asked, about her art. He would call her late at night from his lonely study, and his voice would be different, softer. He would talk about the books he was reading, never business. He once sent her a rare collection of a poet she loved, with no note, no explanation. These were tiny, flickering lights in a vast darkness, moments that Amelia clung to. She sensed that her father saw a different kind of strength in her, the strength to walk away, to define her own value in a world obsessed with price tags. He saw in her an integrity that he, perhaps, feared was missing in his perfect son. He saw the daughter he respected, even if she wasn't the daughter he had designed. This unspoken, unresolved connection was the true, fragile heart of the Sterling dynasty, a heart that had just stopped beating, leaving behind a silence that would soon give way to a terrible storm. A week after the funeral, the final act of the coronation was scheduled to take place. The setting was the law office of Arthur Vance, a man who had served as the Sterling family's legal counsel for 3 decades. His office was a sanctuary of old-world power, a place where fortunes were codified and dynasties were cemented in ink. The air smelled of aged leather, drying paper, and the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco, as if the ghosts of past clients lingered in the thick, wood-paneled walls. It was a room built to convey permanence, to suggest that the words spoken here were as immutable as the laws of physics. The remaining Sterlings sat around a vast mahogany table, a tableau of barely concealed emotion. Ethan was the image of sober responsibility, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed like a second skin. He sat upright, his hands resting calmly on the table, a king waiting for the official proclamation of his reign. He radiated a quiet, almost bored confidence, the energy of a man who has already won the race and is merely waiting for the medal. Beside him, Eleanor was a statue of maternal pride. Her grief had been put away like last season's jewelry, replaced by an expression of serene, triumphant composure. Her gaze occasionally drifted towards Amelia, not with malice, but with a kind of final, dismissive pity. The look one might give a distant, unfortunate relative. Amelia sat opposite them, feeling small and out of place. The cold dread that had taken root at the funeral had now blossomed into a grim certainty. She had no illusions about what was to come. She was not here hoping for a miracle. She was here to witness a sentencing. She had spent the week in a daze, the overheard conversation playing on a loop in her mind. Now, she simply wanted the performance to be over. She met the gaze of Arthur Vance, who sat at the head of the table. The old lawyer looked tired, his face a roadmap of difficult confidences and buried secrets. He offered her a brief, unreadable glance before clearing his throat and opening the large, leather-bound folder before him. His voice, when he began to read, was a dry, steady drone, the sound of finality. He navigated the dense labyrinth of legal terminology, the whereases and herebys and testaments that formed the architecture of her father's final word. Amelia let the words wash over her, a tide of jargon pulling her further and further from the shore of any hope she might have secretly harbored. He detailed the perfunctory bequests first, the donations to museums and universities, the generous pensions for the household staff. Each one was a small, neat transaction, a tying up of loose ends. Then he came to the family. "To my beloved wife, Eleanor Sterling," Arthur read, his voice unwavering. "I bequeath the penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue, its contents, and the entirety of my private art collection. Furthermore, a trust fund shall be established in her name to provide for her comfort and security for the remainder of her life." Eleanor inclined her head, a gesture of regal acceptance. It was what she expected, what she was owed. Arthur turned a page. "To my son, Ethan Richard Sterling," he continued, and here his voice seemed to gather a new weight. "I bequeath my entire controlling interest in Sterling Enterprises, including all shares, voting rights, and associated assets. He shall assume the roles of chairman and chief executive officer, effective immediately. I further bequeath to him the primary family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, and all other real estate holdings, financial portfolios, and personal effects not otherwise specified." The room was utterly still. It was a complete transfer of power, an anointment. Ethan did not smile. He simply straightened his tie, a small, precise movement that spoke volumes. It was the gesture of a man assuming a mantle he had always known was his. The empire had a new king. Amelia held her breath. She knew her turn was next. Arthur Vance paused for a fraction of a second, a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation before he continued. "To my daughter, Amelia Rose Sterling," he read, and the words fell like stones into the silent room. "I bequeath a one-time, lump sum payment of $500,000. He paused again, and then delivered the final, devastating blow. "It is my stated hope that with this sum, she will finally learn the value of a dollar, which she has so long disdained." The silence that followed was immense, a vacuum that sucked all the air from Amelia's lungs. It was not the amount. $500,000 was a fortune to most, but in the context of the Sterling billions, it was dust. It was the words. A public rebuke, a final judgment carved into a legal document for all of eternity. Her father was not just disinheriting her, he was branding her, shaming her from beyond the grave. Every choice she had ever made, her art, her independence, her very identity, had been publicly condemned as a frivolous disdain for the value of money. She could feel the weight of her mother's and brother's eyes on her. She dared not look at them. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Eleanor place a perfectly manicured hand on her arm, a gesture of faux sympathy that felt like a spider crawling on her skin. "Your father always believed in tough love, dear," she whispered, her voice dripping with insincere condolence. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Amy," he said, his voice laced with the patronizing tone he used for underlings, "the offer still stands. If you ever find yourself in trouble, My door is always open." It was the ultimate insult, an offer of charity from the man who now owned her entire world. Something inside Amelia snapped, but it made no sound. There was no outburst, no tears, no pleading. The searing humiliation was instantly cooled by the cold, sharp fury that had been smoldering within her. The pain was real, a physical ache in her chest, but the anger was clarifying. This wasn't her father's final word. This was theirs. This was the final move in a game they had been playing her whole life. She slowly raised her head, her expression a blank mask of calm that she did not feel. She looked at Arthur Vance, the old lawyer who had just read her sentence. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice steady, betraying nothing. Then she stood up. Without a glance at her mother or brother, she turned and walked out of the room. The quiet click of the heavy office door closing behind her was the only sound. It was a sound of absolute finality, the sound of an exile, the sound of a war that had just been declared. Amelia did not flee back to New York. The instinct to run, to escape back to the anonymity of her life, was strong, but it was overshadowed by a colder, heavier feeling. It was the need for a final, formal severance. She drove back to the great stone house, not as a daughter returning home, but as an executor of her own life, there to collect the last fragments of her past before closing the book forever. The journey felt surreal. The familiar winding roads, the towering oak trees that lined the driveway. Everything that once meant home now felt like the approach to a foreign country, a land where she was no longer a citizen. The atmosphere inside the mansion had changed. The oppressive, perfumed silence of morning had evaporated, replaced by a low hum of activity, of a machine being brought back online under new management. Staff moved with a briskness that bordered on cheerful, their expressions a mixture of relief and a desire to please the new master. The house was already breathing in time with Ethan's rhythm. Amelia felt like a ghost, her presence an awkward and unwelcome reminder of a previous era. She walked through the grand foyer, ignoring the sympathetic yet curious glances from the staff, and went straight up the sweeping staircase to her childhood room. It was exactly as she had left it years ago, a time capsule of a girl who no longer existed. Old sketchbooks filled with charcoal drawings, canvases leaning against the walls, a collection of worn-out novels. For a moment, sentimentality threatened to overwhelm her. The grief, which she had packed down under a layer of cold anger, resurfaced. This was her home. That was her father's house. And she had been cast out by a piece of paper, a string of cruel, carefully chosen words. She sank onto her bed, the sheer injustice of it all washing over her. She could just leave. She could take the insulting sum of money, disappear back into her world, and let the Sterling dynasty rot from the inside out. It would be the easy thing to do, the safe thing. But then she remembered the sound of her brother's chuckle at the funeral. The memory was a splash of icy water, chasing away the fog of self-pity. She stood up, her purpose renewed. She was not here to mourn what was lost. She was here to pack. As she gathered a few small, meaningful items, a faded photograph of her as a child on her father's shoulders, a silver locket he had given her for her 16th birthday, she realized there was one more thing. A small, handcrafted wooden box her father had helped her make in his workshop when she was a girl, where she kept her most treasured, non-monetary possessions. She remembered leaving it on the bookshelf in his study. The thought of it falling into Eleanor's hands, to be discarded as clutter, was unbearable. With a deep breath, she walked down the hall to the heart of the house, her father's sanctuary. The heavy oak door to the study was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling into the hallway, and with the light came voices, their voices. This time, there was no need for hushed tones. They were relaxed, triumphant, celebrating their victory in the very room where her father had built his empire. Amelia froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She knew she should walk away, but she was rooted to the spot, compelled to listen. "I must admit," Eleanor was saying. Her voice smooth as brandy, Arthur handled the reading with the appropriate level of solemnity. The line about her learning the value of $1 was a particularly nice touch. "Your idea, I presume?" Ethan laughed, a rich, self-satisfied sound. "Of course, a little posthumous parenting. It's more than she deserves, frankly. $500,000 for doing nothing her entire life. Consider it a nuisance fee, a severance package for a daughter who was never really on the payroll. A chill snaked down Amelia's spine. It wasn't just a will, it was a script, and they were the authors. He was getting so soft near the end, Ethan continued, the sound of ice clinking in a glass punctuating his words. All that talk about ethics, about our legacy. He was looking backwards. I had to spend the last year dragging him and this company into the future. The deals I closed while he was indisposed have already secured our position for the next decade. He was too blind to see it. Blind and sentimental, Eleanor agreed. That ridiculous fascination with Amelia's art. As if it mattered. It's a mercy he went when he did. Another year, and in some fit of maudlin generosity, he might have tried to change things. He might have actually rewarded her failure. The words struck Amelia with a physical force. Each syllable was a hammer blow, shattering the last fragile image she held of her father's final wishes. He hadn't rejected her. He had been managed, steered, his legacy hijacked by the two people he should have been able to trust the most. They hadn't just taken his company. They had stolen his voice, twisting his final words into a weapon to use against his own daughter. They were dancing on his grave, congratulating each other on how they had successfully manipulated a dying man. The immense pain in her chest began to change, to transmute. The heat of her shame and humiliation cooled, then hardened, crystallizing into something cold, sharp, and unbreakable. It was rage, but a quiet, focused rage, pure and absolute. This was no longer about her. It was no longer about the inheritance, the insult, or her own wounded pride. This was about him. They were mocking his memory, belittling his life's work, and turning his name into a shield for their own greed. In that moment, standing silently in the hallway, Amelia Sterling ceased to be the black sheep. She ceased to be the grieving daughter. The girl who ran away to New York to find herself was gone, burned away by the fire of their betrayal. In her place, a woman of purpose was forged. Her quest was no longer for a place in her family, it was for justice for her father. She backed away from the door as silently as she had approached. She did not retrieve the wooden box. It no longer mattered. She returned to her room, her movements now efficient and precise. She packed a small overnight bag, leaving the sketchbooks and canvases behind. They belonged to another life. She walked down the grand staircase, her head held high, ignoring the questioning look from the butler at the door. As she stepped out into the cold, crisp air and walked to her car, she did not look back. She was no longer running from the House of Sterling. She was marching to war against it. The first 48 hours after Amelia left the estate were a blur of sterile hotel rooms and the low hum of a television that was never watched. She didn't go back to New York. Her apartment there was a part of her old life, the life of the artist, the exile. That person was gone. The woman who remained was someone new, someone forged in the cold fire of betrayal, and she needed a place with no memories, a blank canvas upon which to plot her next move. Rage was her constant companion, a white-hot energy that burned away the need for sleep or food. She paced the anonymous hotel room for hours, the cruel words of her mother and brother echoing in the silence. He was getting so soft, a nuisance fee. It's a mercy he went when he did. Each phrase was a fresh wound, but with each repetition, the pain lessened and the clarity grew. Rage, she began to realize, was a powerful fuel, but it was not a map. It could propel her forward, but it couldn't show her the way. Her mind, the same mind that could see the subtle interplay of light and shadow in a painting, began to dissect the situation with a cold, analytical precision. The story they told, the narrative they had inserted into her father's will, was built on a single premise: that Richard Sterling had become weak, sentimental, and mentally frail in his final year. But it felt wrong. Her father was many things demanding, distant, emotionally guarded, but he was never weak. His mind was his fortress. If he had truly developed doubts about Ethan, if he felt his life's work was being corrupted, he wouldn't have simply faded into sentimental confusion. He would have acted. He would have planned. He was a builder, a strategist. He would have built a contingency. This conviction became her North Star. The story they told was a lie, and if it was a lie, there must be proof. But the proof would not be in plain sight. It would be hidden, tucked away somewhere. Only a person who understood his true nature would think to look. And there was only one place that held the keys to her father's mind, his study. The thought of returning to that house, to the lion's den, sent a tremor of fear through her. But the alternative, to walk away and let their lies become his history, was unthinkable. She had to be a ghost. For 2 days, she planned, dredging up memories from her rebellious teenage years. She knew the estate's layout, the blind spots in the security system, the old service entrance in the west wing that was seldom used and had a faulty lock. She waited for the third night, a moonless, overcast Tuesday. Dressed in dark clothes, she parked her car on a forgotten country lane a mile away and walked through the damp woods, the silence of the night broken only by the snapping of twigs under her feet. Entering the house was like stepping into a cold, sleeping body. The air was still and heavy. The grand portraits of her ancestors seemed to follow her with accusing eyes as she moved through the familiar darkness, a phantom in her own past. Every creak of the ancient floorboards was a cannon shot in the silence. The greatest danger was the silence itself. It amplified every risk, every possibility of discovery. Her destination was the study. She reached the heavy oak door and found it locked. Ethan, ever the pragmatist, was already securing his new kingdom. But Amelia remembered an old trick, a loose panel in the wainscoting of the adjoining library that, with some effort, provided access to a narrow crawl space used for wiring. It was a tight, dusty squeeze, but minutes later, she emerged behind her father's great mahogany desk, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was a shrine to him. The scent of his pipe tobacco still clung to the leather chairs. Everything was neat, orderly, exactly as he had left it. Or, more likely, exactly as Ethan and Eleanor had staged it. Amelia's search was not for anything obvious. She was not looking for a hidden ledger or a secret diary. She was looking for an anomaly, a single note out of key in a perfectly composed symphony. Her artist's eye scanned the shelves, the desk, the mantelpiece. Her gaze fell upon the bookshelf nearest his favorite reading chair. It was filled with books on history, economics, and strategy, but among them was a small, worn collection of philosophy. Her father had been a secret admirer of the Stoics, a fact Eleanor had always found bafflingly impractical. He was particularly fond of one book, a leather-bound copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. He had once told her, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that it was a book about how to maintain one's own fortress when the world outside is in chaos. She pulled the book from the shelf. It felt solid, familiar. As she thumbed through the pages, she found a passage underlined in his neat, forceful handwriting. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. It was a message, a whisper across the veil. It was a plea for justice, not vengeance. It was her father's voice, clear and true, cutting through the lies. Her breath hitched. She was on the right path. Encouraged, she inspected the book more closely. She ran her fingers along the inside of the back cover and felt a slight irregularity beneath the paper lining. Carefully, using a letter opener from the desk, she sliced the paper open. Tucked inside, nestled against the hard leather, was a small, ornate, old-fashioned key. It was a key for a safe deposit box. Taped to it was a tiny piece of paper, folded into a tight square. She gently unfolded it. On it, in her father's hand, were 3 words, a name that meant nothing and everything to her. Ask Arthur about Project Nightingale. Project Nightingale. The name was strange, poetic, and utterly out of place in the world of Sterling Enterprises. A nightingale, a bird that sang its most beautiful song in the deepest darkness. It was a clue. It was a beginning. Her vague, formless quest for justice now had a name. She carefully slipped the key and the note into her pocket, her fingers closing around them as if they were the most precious jewels in the world. She left the study the same way she had come, a silent specter retreating back into the night. Back in the sterile safety of her hotel room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, she looked at the 2 small objects in her palm. The key was cold and solid, a tangible piece of a puzzle she was just beginning to understand, and the name, Project Nightingale, echoed in the silent room. Her rage was still there, a pilot light burning steadily within her, but now it was no longer a wild, destructive fire. It was a focused flame, illuminating a single, narrow path forward through the darkness. The ghost had found her purpose. The key felt heavy in Amelia's pocket, a small, cold piece of metal that represented an entire world of unknowns. For a full day, she did nothing but stare at it, and at the name written on the folded paper, Project Nightingale. She knew her next move had to be Arthur Vance. But the thought of returning to that suffocating, mahogany-paneled office, the scene of her public humiliation, was daunting. The last time she was there, she was a lamb being led to the slaughter. This time, she had to walk in as a hunter, even if her only weapon was a cryptic clue. She understood that a direct confrontation would be disastrous. Arthur was the family's lawyer, which now meant he was Ethan's lawyer. He was a fortress of legal ethics and professional discretion. A frontal assault would only cause him to raise the drawbridge and lock the gates. She had to find a different way in. She called his private line, her voice a carefully rehearsed study in calm resolution. She didn't sound angry or desperate. She sounded like a daughter tying up a final, personal loose end. She requested a brief, private meeting, stating only that it concerned a personal effect of her father's she had recently discovered. The appointment was set for the following afternoon. Walking into the office for the second time felt different. The room was the same, the scent of leather and old paper was the same, but Amelia was not. The shame and hurt that had defined her previous visit were gone, replaced by a cold, watchful clarity. She was no longer a victim of the events in this room. She was an investigator, returning to the scene of the crime. Arthur Vance greeted her with a professional, slightly weary courtesy. His expression was one of paternal patience, the look of a man expecting to deal with a predictable, emotional appeal. He likely thought she was there to beg for more money, to contest the will on some flimsy, sentimental grounds. "Amelia," he began, gesturing to the chair she had sat in before. "It's good to see you. I hope you are managing under the circumstances." "I'm managing, Arthur," she replied, her voice even. She sat down, her posture poised, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She let the silence hang in the air for a moment, disrupting his rhythm, taking control of the room's tempo. "I'm not here to contest the will," she said, and saw a flicker of surprise, perhaps relief, in his eyes. He had been preparing for a fight, and she had just lowered her weapons. It was a calculated move to disarm him. "I've accepted my father's decision, but there's something I don't understand." He steepled his fingers, leaning back in his large leather chair. "The law can be complex," he offered, his tone still that of a patient teacher. "It's not about the law," Amelia countered softly. "It's about my father, my mother, and Ethan. They seem to believe he wasn't himself in his final months, that he was confused, sentimental, but that isn't the man I knew. The father I remember, even the one I argued with, was always lucid. He was a strategist. He was always 5 steps ahead of everyone, including himself." She watched him closely as she spoke. She saw a subtle shift, a tensing around his eyes. She had struck a chord. He knew, better than anyone, the truth of her words. She had validated the man he had served for 30 years, subtly aligning herself with his memory of Richard against Ethan and Eleanor's convenient narrative. Having opened the door just a crack, she made her move. She reached into her pocket and slowly, deliberately, placed the small, folded piece of paper on the vast, polished expanse of the mahogany desk. She pushed it gently across the surface towards him. "I found this," she said simply. It was inside his favorite copy of Meditations. Arthur picked up the note. His movements were slow, but his eyes were sharp. He unfolded it. Amelia watched as his gaze fell upon the 3 words written in Richard Sterling's hand. For a moment, the professional mask of Arthur Vance slipped entirely. It was not a dramatic reaction, but to an artist's observant eye, it was a seismic event. His breathing hitched, almost imperceptibly. The network of fine lines around his eyes tightened. The weary patience vanished. replaced by a sudden, intense focus. He looked up from the note, and for the first time, he was not looking at the black sheep, the disinherited daughter. He was looking at a messenger from his oldest and most important client. He was looking at Richard Sterling's contingency plan. This was with it, Amelia said, placing the small, ornate key on the desk beside the note. Arthur stared at the two objects as if they were live wires. He was silent for a long time, the only sound in the room, the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He was a man trapped between two duties, his legal obligation to the current estate, run by Ethan, and his profound personal loyalty to the man who had written this note. Amelia waited, knowing that the next words spoken would determine everything. Finally, he looked at her, his expression now one of grave seriousness. "Your father," he began, his voice low and careful, "was the most meticulous man I have ever known. He believed that a true leader must always have a plan B and a plan C. He called them contingencies for the soul. He had chosen his side. He would not, could not, break his professional code, but he would honor his friend's last wish." He tapped the note. "Project Nightingale," he said, the name sounding strange and significant in the quiet room. "This was the internal designation your father gave to a comprehensive review, a highly confidential assessment of the long-term health and leadership of Sterling Enterprises. Your father believed in due diligence, not just for his investments, but for his legacy." He was giving her the truth, wrapped in the protective layers of corporate jargon. His eyes then fell to the key. He did not touch it. Richard utilized several private facilities over the years for the storage of sensitive corporate and personal documents. He valued discretion. He leaned forward, his voice dropping further. "I am, of course, bound by confidentiality. But I am a student of history and of hardware. That key appears to be of the type used by the Metropolitan Trust Bank, a very private institution on the West Side. Your father maintained a box there for many years." He was not telling her to go. He was simply making an observation. He was giving her a map without ever drawing it. A silent, powerful understanding passed between them. They were now allies, co-conspirators in a plot set in motion by a dead man. As Amelia stood to leave, Arthur spoke one last time, his voice imbued with a warmth she had never heard from him before. "Amelia," he said, meeting her eyes directly, "your father could be a difficult, demanding man. But he was brilliant, and he never did anything without a reason. Whatever you may think, whatever that will said, he had immense, profound faith in your character, in your integrity. It was the validation she never knew she needed. It was a gift more valuable than any inheritance." She walked out of that office, not with a fortune, but with something far more powerful, a destination, a purpose, and the knowledge that she was not fighting alone. The keeper of secrets had opened the gate. Now, she just had to be brave enough to walk through it. The following morning, Amelia walked into the Metropolitan Trust Bank. It was less a bank and more a mausoleum for money, a silent, imposing structure of gray marble and polished brass on the city's west side. The air was cool and still, and the only sound was the soft, rhythmic click of her heels on the floor. There were no tellers, no lines, just a few discreetly placed desks where men in perfectly tailored suits spoke in hushed tones. It was a place designed to make one feel small, a fortress built to guard the secrets of the powerful. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her expression was a careful study in neutrality. She presented her identification and the small, ornate key to a severe-looking man behind a thick pane of glass. He examined her driver's license, then the key, his eyes betraying nothing. He made a quiet phone call, and a moment later, a bank officer emerged from a paneled wall that Amelia hadn't realized was a door. He led her, in near total silence, down a carpeted hallway, through a set of heavy steel bars, and into the vault. The vault was a world of cold, controlled silence. Rows upon rows of gleaming metal boxes, each one a potential Pandora's box of secrets, lined the walls. The officer used his own key in conjunction with hers, and with a heavy, satisfying thud, a long, narrow drawer slid open. He retrieved the metal box, number 713, and escorted her to a small, private viewing room. He placed the box on the table, gave a slight, formal bow, and left, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, sealing her in with her father's last secret. For a long moment, she simply stared at the cold, metal container. It was an ordinary object, yet it felt charged with a potent, almost dangerous energy. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, there was no gold, no jewels, no bearer bonds. It was something far more valuable. It was an arsenal. On top lay a sleek, black external hard drive with a simple white label that read, Nightingale. Beneath it, a series of meticulously organized manila folders. The first one she opened contained bank statements, but not for Sterling Enterprises. They were for offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland under the name of a shell corporation she had never heard of. But the signatory on the account was a name she knew all too well, Ethan R. Sterling. Pinned to the statements were printouts of wire transfers, a steady stream of money flowing out of a subsidiary of the family company and into these hidden accounts. Her father had annotated them in the margins, his neat script a stark contrast to the ugly truth the numbers told. He had drawn arrows, circled dates, created a devastatingly clear map of his son's theft. Another folder contained correspondence. There was a desperate, pleading letter from the CEO of a smaller, family-run competitor, a man Richard had respected for years. He wrote of a sudden, hostile takeover attempt, of corporate sabotage, of tactics so brutal they bordered on illegal. Ethan had driven the man's company into the ground, then bought it for pennies on the dollar, a move he had framed to the board as a brilliant, aggressive expansion. Here was the truth, the human cost of his brilliance. There was also a copy of a resignation letter from his father's longtime chief financial officer, a man who had been with the company for 40 years. It was a formal, terse letter, but clipped to it was a private, handwritten note to Richard. I cannot, in good conscience, it read, sign off on these numbers. What your son is doing is not business. It is a betrayal of everything you built. Amelia packed everything back into the box and left the bank, carrying the weight of her family's implosion in her hands. She returned to the sterile anonymity of her hotel room, which she now began to transform into a war room. She bought a new encrypted laptop, one that had never touched the Sterling network. She plugged in the Nightingale drive. It contained a digital replica of the paper files and so much more. There were encrypted spreadsheets that detailed the full extent of the embezzlement, totaling not hundreds of thousands, but millions of dollars. There were audio files, secretly recorded phone calls her father had made when his suspicions had first been aroused. She listened, her blood running cold, to Ethan's smooth, confident voice lying to his own father, assuring him that a struggling division was profitable, that a key executive had left on good terms, that a risky venture was a sure thing. For days that bled into a week, Amelia did not leave the room. She subsisted on coffee and a cold, burning sense of purpose. She printed out the most critical documents and pinned them to the walls of the hotel room, the cream-colored wallpaper disappearing behind a spiderweb of evidence. She used red yarn to connect shell corporations to offshore accounts, wire transfers to Ethan's lavish personal expenses, a yacht he had secretly purchased, a failed real estate deal he had covered up with company money. An artist's eye for patterns now served a grim new purpose. She was no longer creating a picture, she was revealing one that had been deliberately hidden, a portrait of breathtaking greed and deception. This was not a triumphant investigation. It was a slow, agonizing excavation of her family's ruin. With every new piece of evidence, she felt a fresh wave of her father's pain. She realized that Project Nightingale was not a vengeful plot. It was a father's chronicle of heartbreak. Richard Sterling had spent his final year not in senile confusion, but in a state of horrified clarity, secretly documenting the moral collapse of the son he had groomed for greatness. The project wasn't about punishing Ethan. It was about understanding how the boy he had raised could have become this monster. At the bottom of the safe deposit box, beneath all the evidence, was one last item, a thick, leather-bound journal. She had saved it for last, instinctively knowing it would be the most difficult part of the journey. She opened it, and finally, she heard her father's true voice, raw and unfiltered, reaching out to her from the grave. The hotel room was a chaotic collage of corporate malfeasance, a testament to her brother's greed. But amidst the pinned-up documents and flowcharts, the leather-bound journal felt like a sacred object. It was the only thing in the room that spoke of a human heart. With a deep, trembling breath, Amelia sat on the floor, crossed her legs, and opened it. The first page was dated almost a year ago to the day. The handwriting was her father's, unmistakable in its sharp, decisive strokes, but there was a weariness in the lines she had never seen before. It did not begin as a chronicle of betrayal. It began with confusion. The early entries were short, questioning. Ethan presented the quarterly reports today. The numbers are strong, almost too strong. Something feels polished, overly rehearsed. A week later, had lunch with Jim Aberdeen. He tells me his son was forced out of the R&D department. Ethan told me the boy left for a better offer. Jim says he was fired for raising ethical concerns about Project X. Each entry was a small, discordant note, a single thread being pulled from a magnificent tapestry. He wrote of his attempts to dismiss his own concerns, to attribute them to his age, to a generational gap in business philosophy. He wanted to believe in the son he had created. Then came the entry that changed everything. It was dated 6 months before his death. The fortress has been breached from within. Today, I found the first real proof. The wire transfers to the Calypso Holdings account, a shell corporation. His shell corporation. Millions. It was not a mistake. It was not aggressive business. It was theft. The boy I raised, the heir to my life's work, is a common thief. There is a coldness in my chest that has nothing to do with my health. I looked at him across the dinner table tonight. He smiled, told a charming story, and I saw a stranger. I saw a hollow man where my son used to be. From that point on, the journal transformed. It became the logbook of a captain watching his own ship sink, sabotaged by his first mate. He chronicled his secret investigation, Project Nightingale, with a grim, methodical clarity. He documented every lie, every stolen dollar, every loyal employee Ethan cast aside. He wrote of the crushing loneliness of his discovery, made worse by his wife's complicity. Eleanor sees only what she wants to see, one entry read. She sees a king. She has polished this golden idol for so long, she can no longer tell that it is hollow. She encourages his ruthlessness, calling it strength. She is so terrified of appearing weak, she has forgotten what it means to be strong. After pages and pages detailing Ethan's sins, the journal's focus shifted. His thoughts, heavy with disappointment, turned to the child he had pushed away. The tone softened, filled with a regret that was almost too painful for Amelia to read. In my obsession with forging an heir in my own image, I failed to see the child who was already my equal. I saw Ethan's ambition and mistook it for my own. I saw Amelia's rebellion and mistook it for weakness. I was a fool. Her rebellion was not against me. It was against the gilded cage I had built. She chose integrity over inheritance. She chose to build something of her own, however small, rather than simply occupy something she had not earned. How could I have been so blind? He wrote of her art, and Amelia began to sob, silent tears streaming down her face. I have followed her career from a distance. I have a private collection of her early works that no one knows about. In her paintings, I see what this company has lost. I see honesty. I see a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. I see a soul that cannot be bought. Ethan's gold is merely plating. Amelia's soul, that is the genuine article. That is true sterling quality. In the final entries, his plan took shape, born from heartbreak and a fierce, protective love. He knew he was dying. He knew he had little time. He couldn't just expose Ethan. The scandal would shatter the company. He couldn't just give the empire to Amelia. She wasn't ready. And Ethan and Eleanor would destroy her. So, I must build one last thing, he wrote. A test. A path through the darkness. The first will is a charade, a sleeping draft for the serpents in my house. It will make them arrogant, careless. The second will, the true will, is the sword. But I cannot place it in her hand. She must find it. She must follow the clues and unearth the truth for herself. She must build her own resolve, her own strength. If she can do this, she will be ready. If she cannot, then the empire was not meant to survive anyway. The very last page of the journal was a letter addressed to her. My dearest Amelia, if you are reading this, then my gambit has succeeded, and my faith in you was justified. I know you must be in a world of pain, and for the part I played in that, I am truly sorry. I was a distant father, a man who spoke the language of balance sheets better than the language of the heart. I let you believe I was disappointed in you, when in fact, you were the one I was most proud of. I am not asking you to do what comes next out of vengeance. Vengeance is a shallow victory. I am asking you to do it for the thousands of employees and their families whose livelihoods depend on the integrity of the Sterling name. I am asking you to restore the honor that your brother has so carelessly squandered. He believes his inheritance is a prize. He is wrong. It is a responsibility. I am not leaving you a fortune, my daughter. I am leaving you a choice and the power to see it through. Know this, wherever you are, you were always the strongest of us all. I love you. I am so proud to be your father. Amelia closed the journal, hugging it to her chest as a lifetime of unspoken words finally washed over her. The rage that had fueled her for weeks was extinguished, replaced by a profound, aching love. Her mission was no longer about revenge for herself. It was about justice for him. She was not the black sheep, the disinherited daughter. She was the chosen one, the secret guardian of his true legacy. She wept for the father she had lost, and for the father she had only just found in the pages of a book. When the tears finally subsided, a calm, unshakable resolve settled in her heart. She looked at the wall of evidence, no longer a map of betrayal, but a blueprint for justice. Her father had given her the sword. Now, it was time to wield it. The tears she shed over her father's journal were a baptism. They washed away the last remnants of the lost, wounded girl she had been, and in her place stood a woman of terrifying, quiet resolve. The storm of grief had passed, and what it left behind was a serene and formidable calm. She was no longer a victim seeking revenge. She was the chosen executor of her father's final, most important directive. Her purpose was no longer a question, it was a fact, as solid and real as the journal she held in her hands. Her hotel room, which had been a chaotic nest of pain and discovery, was the first thing to change. Over the next 72 hours, she transformed it into a clinical, organized command center. The wild spiderweb of yarn and documents on the wall was taken down. She scanned every single piece of paper, encrypted the files, and organized them on the Nightingale Drive with a precision that would have made her father proud. She created a master document, a clear, concise executive summary of Ethan's crimes, complete with dates, account numbers, and direct references to the corresponding evidence. Her artist's mind, accustomed to finding the narrative in chaos, created timelines and flowcharts that made the complex web of deceit brutally, elegantly simple. This was not just an act of organization, it was an act of mastery. She was taking complete ownership of the truth, absorbing it until it was a part of her. When she was ready, she called Arthur Vance. The tone of her voice was different, and he must have sensed it immediately. It held no questions, only a calm authority. She did not request a meeting, she scheduled one. When she walked into his office this time, the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was not a grieving daughter or a hopeful petitioner. She carried a sleek, modern briefcase, and she moved with the focused grace of a prosecutor about to deliver a closing argument. She sat opposite Arthur, opened her laptop, and placed a single, neatly bound document on the polished table between them. "This is a summary," she began, her voice low and steady. "The full body of evidence is on this drive. I believe you'll find it comprehensive." For the next hour, she presented her case. She did not raise her voice. She did not speak of betrayal or pain. She spoke of wire fraud, of embezzlement, of corporate malfeasance, of breach of fiduciary duty. She walked him through the offshore accounts, played a short, damning segment from a recorded phone call, and showed him the fabricated reports Ethan had presented to her father. She presented the facts with such cold, irrefutable logic that it was no longer a family drama. It was an open and shut criminal case. Arthur Vance, a man who had seen the worst of human nature in his long career, listened in stunned silence. He had known Richard suspected something was wrong, but the sheer scale and audacity of Ethan's crimes, laid bare with such clinical precision, was beyond anything he had imagined. But more than that, he was mesmerized by the woman across the table. He was seeing Richard Sterling's strategic mind, his meticulous attention to detail, reborn in the daughter everyone had written off. The old man's final desperate gamble on his black sheep no longer seemed like a gamble at all. It looked like genius. When she was finished, he took a deep, slow breath. "The second will is ironclad, Amelia," he said, his voice filled with a new respect. "And this is more than enough to not only execute it, but to ensure that your brother faces serious legal consequences. The question is not if we act, the question is how." "My father's journal made his wishes clear," Amelia replied. "This isn't about a quiet transfer of power. It's about a cleansing. It has to be done in the light, in front of the people he trusted to be the stewards of his company." They spent the next 2 hours mapping out the strategy. It would be a formal, legally binding meeting of the Sterling Enterprises Board of Directors. Ethan and Eleanor would be summoned as well. Arthur would act as the officiant of this corporate execution. They set the date for 1 week from today. That week was the calm before the storm. Amelia checked out of the hotel and moved into a small, furnished apartment in a quiet, unassuming part of the city. Her life became a monastic routine of quiet preparation. The fire of her rage had been banked, transformed into a steady, patient heat. She spent her days not gloating or plotting revenge, but studying. She read the company's charter and bylaws. She researched the professional histories of every single board member, understanding their allegiances, their strengths, their weaknesses. She was not preparing to win a fight, she was preparing to lead. She was honoring the responsibility her father had bestowed upon her. Meanwhile, the world Ethan and Eleanor inhabited was blissfully, arrogantly unaware of the abyss opening beneath their feet. Ethan was at the pinnacle of his triumph. A feature article in a major business magazine had just been published, a glossy 10-page spread hailing him as the new Lion of Wall Street, a visionary remaking his father's legacy for the modern age. He was photographed in the study, his father's study, looking powerful and contemplative. Eleanor, for her part, hosted the annual Sterling Foundation Charity Gala, the glittering social event of the season. She glided through the ballroom, draped in jewels, accepting accolades for her son's success, her face a mask of regal satisfaction. She had won. The dynasty was secure. The flawed part of their lineage had been neatly excised, and the future was a golden, unbroken line. They were so high up, they couldn't feel the ground shaking. On the final day of that week, Arthur Vance made the calls and sent the emails. A formal summons was delivered to Ethan, to Eleanor, and to each of the 9 members of the board. The language was precise, legal, and non-negotiable. They were being called to an emergency meeting the following morning at 10 o'clock sharp. The agenda was stated simply and ominously: to address a critical and time-sensitive matter concerning the final testament of Richard Sterling and the future leadership of Sterling Enterprises. Held that evening, as the city lights began to sparkle to life outside her window, Amelia stood in the quiet of her small apartment. She held her father's journal in her hands, its worn leather, a comforting weight. She was not anxious, she was not afraid, she was ready. All the pieces were in place on the board. The trap had been set, and the storm, after a week of patient waiting, was finally about to break. The boardroom of Sterling Enterprises was a cathedral of power, 20 floors above the city. A long, dark, polished table reflected the grim sky like a black mirror. The 9 members of the board, a collection of the most powerful figures in finance and industry, were assembled, their faces a mixture of confusion, irritation, and intrigue. They were not men and women accustomed to being summoned on short notice to a meeting with no clear agenda. The doors opened, and Ethan Sterling entered, with his mother, Eleanor, at his side. He moved with the easy, proprietary grace of a man who owned the very air in the room. He was annoyed, but he wore it well. His expression, one of patient authority, a king bothered by a minor courtly squabble. He nodded to the board, a silent reassurance that he would dispense with this foolishness quickly. Eleanor, a vision in charcoal gray silk, took a seat slightly behind him, the perfect image of the silent, supportive Queen Mother. They saw Arthur Vance, already seated at the head of the table, and exchanged a look of contemptuous amusement. The old lawyer was getting sentimental in his dotage. Just as Ethan was about to speak, the doors opened one last time. Amelia walked in. The effect was instantaneous and profound. A ripple of shock went through the room. She was not the sullen artist in black, the awkward girl from the funeral. The woman who stood before them was poised, her simple but impeccably tailored navy dress speaking a language of quiet, formidable power. Her hair was pulled back, her face was clear of all but the most minimal makeup, and her eyes held a calm, unnerving intensity. She didn't look at her mother or brother. She simply took a vacant seat at the table, placed a small portfolio in front of her, and waited. Ethan stared at her, his annoyance curdling into disbelief. "Amelia? What in God's name are you doing here? This is a board meeting." He turned his glare on Arthur. "And you, Arthur, I trust you have a very good explanation for this theatrical production." Arthur Vance did not flinch. His voice, when he spoke, was cold and formal, devoid of any deference. "This meeting has been called in my capacity as the primary executor of the estate of Richard Sterling," he began, his words dropping like stones into the tense silence. "Information has come to light which requires the immediate and formal review of his final bequests and the leadership of this company." "This is absurd," Eleanor interjected, her voice like ice. "The matter of my husband's will is settled. It has been legally executed." "Indeed," Ethan said, slamming his hand lightly on the table. "This meeting is a waste of everyone's time. I move to adjourn." "You are not the chairman of this meeting, Ethan," Arthur said flatly. Then he delivered the first blow. "And you are not, as it turns out, the chairman of this company. I am here today to execute Richard Sterling's final, binding last will and testament, signed, witnessed, and notarized on October 12th of last year, a date which, you will find, supersedes the document we read previously." Chaos erupted. Ethan shot to his feet, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "You're senile. This is a farce. My father was sick. He wasn't in his right mind." He spat, pointing a trembling finger at Amelia. "She has manipulated you." Arthur remained impassive, waiting for the outburst to subside. "Richard anticipated you might question his mental state, Ethan," he said calmly, "which is why he prepared a statement." He gestured to his laptop, and the large screen at the end of the boardroom flickered to life. And then he was there, Richard Sterling. He was sitting in his study, looking directly into the camera. He was thinner, paler, but his eyes were blazing with a fierce, undiminished fire. The entire room was frozen, held captive by the ghost on the screen. "If you are watching this," Richard's voice filled the room, as commanding in death as it had been in life, "it means my daughter, Amelia, has succeeded. It means my faith was well placed. I am recording this on October 15th, and I am of sound mind and, for the moment, sound body." He looked around the room, as if making eye contact with each board member. "To my friends on this board, I apologize for the subterfuge, but a cancer has been growing in my company, a cancer of greed and dishonor, and it must be cut out." His gaze seemed to sharpen, to land directly on his son. "Ethan, I raised you to be a leader, but you learned only the lessons of a tyrant. I taught you the value of strength, and you learned only the brutality of power. While I was fighting for my life, you were stealing from the company I built, lying to my face, and dismantling my legacy piece by piece. I did not build an empire for a thief to sit on my throne." His expression softened as he spoke again. "And Amelia, my daughter whom I failed in so many ways, I pushed you away because you would not conform. I see now that your integrity, your refusal to be bought, your quiet strength, these are the most valuable assets a Sterling can possess. The child who seemed furthest from my world was the only one who truly understood its worth." He took a final, deep breath. "Therefore, I hereby state for the record that I revoke any and all previous wills and testaments. The document Arthur Vance holds today is my final word, my true legacy." The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute, profound, a perfect vacuum. Ethan stood, swaying slightly, his face ashen. Eleanor's hand was at her throat, her porcelain mask finally shattered, revealing the horrified, broken woman beneath. Before they could even process the video, Arthur spoke again. "For the record," he said, and the screen flickered back to life. This time, it showed a flowchart, a devastatingly simple diagram of shell corporations and offshore accounts. His voice was a merciless monotone as he pointed out the flow of millions from Sterling Enterprises into an account in the Cayman Islands. A second slide showed a bank statement. A third, a transcript of a phone call, with Ethan's voice, smooth and confident, lying to an investor. It was an execution, quick, brutal, and undeniable. The board members stared, their faces masks of shock and dawning fury. They had not just been deceived, they had been made fools of. Into the dead silence, Arthur unsealed the document before him. "The last will and testament of Richard Sterling," he read. He detailed the minor bequests, and then came to the heart of it. "To my son, Ethan Sterling, I leave nothing. He has already taken his inheritance through theft and deceit. He is disinherited completely. To my wife, Eleanor Sterling, the trust established in the previous will is hereby reduced to a lifetime annuity of $100,000 per year to ensure she is cared for, but to sever her influence over this company forever." Eleanor let out a small, strangled gasp, the sound of a life's work turning to dust. Arthur took a breath and read the final, world-altering clause. "All of my remaining assets, including my full controlling interest and all voting shares of Sterling Enterprises, the entirety of my personal fortune, and all real estate holdings, I bequeath to my daughter, Amelia Rose Sterling. It is my final wish that she assume the role of chairwoman and CEO, and that this board give her its full and unconditional support in restoring the honor of the Sterling name." It was over. Ethan collapsed back into his chair, not with a roar of anger, but with a silent, wheezing gasp, a man who had been punched in the soul. Eleanor made a low, wounded sound, a single, tearing sob that was the death rattle of her dynasty. The board members, to a person, turned their eyes from the disgraced son and the broken mother and looked at Amelia. She had not moved. She had not smiled. Her expression was one of solemn, heavy responsibility. She had won. The reckoning was complete. And a new queen, forged in fire and silence, was about to take the throne. The silence that followed the reading of the will was not empty. It was a dense, heavy substance filled with the wreckage of a fallen dynasty. It was broken by a single sharp sound, the scrape of a chair. One of the board members, a stern, white-haired man named George Carmichael, who had been Richard's first investor, stood up. He did not look at Amelia. He looked at the shell of the man who had been his friend's son. "Ethan," he said, his voice a low, cold rumble of disgust, "I think it's time for you to leave." Ethan looked up, his eyes wild and uncomprehending, like an animal caught in a trap. He opened his mouth to protest, to rage, but no sound came out. The arrogance that had been his armor was gone, leaving only a raw, pathetic vulnerability. He was no longer the king. He was a trespasser. When he didn't move, George nodded curtly to the head of security standing by the door. There was no struggle. Ethan Sterling, the new lion of Wall Street, was escorted from the boardroom like a disgraced junior executive. His exit, a quiet, humiliating shuffle. The doors closed behind him, and his presence was instantly erased, a ghost who had haunted the room for a lifetime, now finally exorcised. With her son gone, Eleanor seemed to shrink, to fold in on herself. The regal posture collapsed, leaving a frail old woman in its place. Her eyes, wide and vacant, found Amelia's across the long, polished table. For the first time, there was no judgment in her gaze, no disappointment. There was only a vast, terrifying clarity, the look of a woman staring at the architect of her own oblivion. She had poured her entire existence into creating a perfect son, a perfect heir, and in doing so, had completely ignored the daughter who had just effortlessly, ruthlessly, taken it all away. She rose on unsteady legs and, without another word, allowed Arthur to guide her from the room, her quiet, broken sobs the only eulogy for the future she had lost. Now, there was only Amelia and the board. 9 pairs of powerful, uncertain eyes were fixed on her. The company, their fortunes, now rested in the hands of this complete unknown. The silence returned, this time filled with questions, with skepticism, with the tense, pragmatic calculus of survival. Amelia took a slow, deliberate breath, the first she felt she had taken all day. She did not stand. She did not move to the head of the table. She simply spoke from where she was, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Thank you for your attention. I know that what has just transpired is a shock, and I know that I am not the leader any of you were expecting." She paused, letting the truth of that sink in. The evidence you have seen today is not just a family matter. It is a corporate matter. My father's true legacy was not profit or power or the name on the side of this building. It was integrity. That integrity has been fundamentally compromised. My only priority is to restore it. Her words were direct, devoid of the corporate jargon they were used to. She looked at George Carmichael. "Mr. Carmichael, with the board's permission, my first act will be to commission a full, independent forensic audit of the last 2 years. We need to know the full extent of the damage. My second act is to ask you, as my father's oldest friend and partner, if you would agree to serve as an interim advisor to me as we navigate this transition." It was a brilliant move. It showed transparency, a lack of fear, and a deep respect for the company's institutional memory. It was not the act of a vengeful daughter, but of a responsible leader. George Carmichael, his stern face unreadable, stared at her for a long moment, and then gave a single, decisive nod. One by one, the other board members followed suit. In the space of 5 minutes, with fewer than 100 words, Amelia Sterling had seized control not just of the company's shares, but of its future. The fallout outside the boardroom was immediate and explosive. The news broke that afternoon, and a media firestorm erupted. Headlines screamed from every news outlet: Sterling dynasty in Chow's, golden son disinherited, secret daughter, Amelia Sterling, takes control of billion-dollar empire. The carefully curated myth of the perfect American family was publicly, spectacularly immolated. Ethan's downfall was as swift as it was brutal. The board, with Amelia's full support, pressed charges. He became a creature of the tabloids. His furious, hunted face, a permanent feature on the nightly news as he scurried between his town car and his lawyer's office. His friends abandoned him. His social invitations dried up. His corporate death was followed by a swift and merciless social execution. Eleanor simply vanished. She retreated to the Fifth Avenue penthouse, now a gilded cage, and pulled the world in behind her. The undisputed queen of New York society became a recluse, the curtains always drawn, her only companions, the ghosts of the legacy she had so carefully designed and so utterly lost. Amelia, meanwhile, stood in the center of the wreckage. 2 days after the meeting, she walked into her father's office, now her office. The space was immense, intimidating, a glass-walled perch overlooking the city. It didn't feel like a prize. It felt like a responsibility that weighed more than the building itself. She saw the fresh cover of the business magazine on the desk, the one that hailed Ethan as a visionary. She picked it up, looked at her brother's smiling, triumphant face, and dropped it into the wastebasket. She did not try to be the leader her father was, or the one her brother pretended to be. Her first all-hands meeting was not in the auditorium, but in the cavernous employee cafeteria. She stood not on a stage, but in the middle of the floor, and spoke with a directness and vulnerability that was utterly foreign to the culture of Sterling Enterprises. She spoke of the betrayal, not just to her family, but to them, the employees. She promised not easy profits, but a difficult, honest path back to integrity. Late that night, she was alone in the vast, silent office. The city was a glittering tapestry of light below. The desk was clear, except for 2 items. One was her father's worn copy of Meditations. The other was a small wooden box. Arthur had retrieved it from the house and had it sent over. She opened it. Inside lay no corporate secrets, only the treasures of a girl she used to be. A few sticks of charcoal, a smooth stone from a forgotten beach, a photograph of a smiling man with his young daughter on his shoulders. She looked from the small, priceless contents of the box to the immense, sprawling power of the city outside her window. The ashes of her family were all around her. But here, in the quiet heart of the empire she now controlled, she could feel the first, faint warmth of an ember, the promise of a new fire, one that would burn clean and true. 6 months passed. The seasons changed, and with them, the very soul of Sterling Enterprises began to shift. The chaos of the public implosion had settled into a kind of legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms and country clubs of the elite. The name Sterling, once synonymous with ruthless power, was now being redefined by a leader who wielded her authority with a quiet, unnerving grace. The company, under Amelia, was breathing again. The culture of fear and backbiting that Ethan had fostered was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a new ethos of transparency and collaborative creation. She had promoted veterans who had been sidelined, people who remembered her father's founding principles. She spent more time with the engineers and the product designers than she did with the bankers, and the result was a resurgence of innovation, of purpose. She was not just running a company, she was healing it. The final fates of the fallen royals were delivered not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of the wheels of justice. Ethan's trial was a brief, humiliating affair. Presented with the irrefutable evidence from the Nightingale Drive, his defense crumbled. He was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The last time Amelia saw him, he was a hollowed-out man in a too-large suit, his golden boy charm gone, replaced by the dull, flat look of defeat. He was sentenced to a decade in a federal prison, a final, ignominious end to a life of unearned privilege. There was no triumph in it for Amelia, only a deep, somber sense of waste. She paid one final visit to her mother. The Fifth Avenue penthouse, once a glittering stage for Eleanor's social ambitions, had become a silent, lonely museum. Eleanor was a ghost haunting its halls, surrounded by priceless art and meaningless trophies. She was impeccably dressed, her hair perfectly coiffed, but her eyes were empty. There was no reconciliation. There were no tears. "He was my son," Eleanor said, her voice brittle as ancient lace. "My perfect boy. And you took everything from him. From me." Amelia finally understood. Her mother was not mourning a son. She was mourning a reflection of herself, an ambition that had been shattered. Amelia left without another word, quietly closing the door on a part of her life that could never be repaired. With the past formally laid to rest, Amelia began to look to the future. She decided it was time to make her father's office truly her own. It was a space she had preserved, but now it was time for it to reflect her, not him. While directing movers, she ran her hand along the underside of the massive mahogany desk, a final, tactile farewell to the man who had sat there for 40 years. Her fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible switch. With a soft click, a shallow, hidden drawer slid open from the desk's front panel. It was a compartment so cleverly concealed, only someone seeking to know the desk intimately, not just to rule from behind it, would ever have found it. Inside, there was a single, thick envelope, sealed with her father's personal wax stamp. Her name was written on the front, in his familiar, sharp script. Her heart pounded as she opened it. It was not a legal document, it was a letter. His final, true, last word. "My dearest Amelia," it began. "If you are reading this, then you have not only won, you have begun to lead. You have found this not as an investigator, but as an inheritor making this space your own. And that makes me prouder than you can ever know. There are things I could not write in my journal, things I could only say to you now, when the war is over. I need you to understand that my final plan was never just about saving my company. It was about saving my children from the cages I helped build. I bound Ethan by calling him the Golden Child, and he spent his life suffocating under the weight of that hollow crown. And I bound you by calling you the Black Sheep, and you spent your life believing your greatest strengths were your deepest flaws. They were both cages, and I, in my pride and blindness, was the locksmith. For that, I am eternally sorry. The inheritance, the money, the power. Do not be fooled, my daughter. That was never the real gift. It was a burden, a tool, a heavy sword I was forced to place in your hand. The true inheritance, the one I truly wanted to give you, is the freedom you are feeling right now. The freedom that comes from staring into the abyss of your past and not flinching. The freedom to be the brilliant artist and the formidable leader, all at once. The freedom to be completely, unapologetically, yourself. That is the only fortune worth having. So do not feel the weight of my legacy. Create your own. Don't just run my company. Build something beautiful. Live a life of meaning. That is all a father could ever wish for. The letter trembled in her hands. The final, immense weight on her soul lifted. The victory had always felt heavy, a duty fulfilled. But now, she understood. Her father hadn't just given her a company. He had given her back to herself. She looked out the window at the sprawling city below, a landscape of infinite possibility. It was no longer a kingdom she had to rule. It was a canvas. And she was, at last, free to paint. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. Do not mistake their quiet for acceptance or their stillness for weakness. For in that silence, they are not just surviving. They are observing, they are learning, they are planning, and when they finally choose to speak, their voice will be the one that commands the attention of the entire world. Thank you for listening to the story of the Sterling family. Justice takes many forms, and sometimes the most patient heart wields the sharpest sword. Join us next time for another story.